The first 3 weeks of the eruption here in Hawaii, crazy things would happen in the middle of the night. A new fissure would open up and it would threaten a new neighborhood. Thousands of people were evacuated from their homes. I started the Hawaii Tracker Facebook group to help people understand what's going on and get their questions answered.
Hey, how's it going? We're live. This is Fissure 20.
We had hundreds of people all throughout the neighborhoods sending in videos, articles, and images. We spend a lot of time making sure the accurate information gets out.
This is live. Still lava moving.
They weren't just sharing a story, they were helping their neighbor. If a family was being evacuated, my group would just jump in and help out. So it was huge. They were watching out for each other.
Hello everybody, thank you for coming. Thank you for the support from everybody.
As we go through this, we're growing closer together as a community. When tragedies like this strike, you really realize how much you need each other.
Aloha, everybody. I am geologist Philip Ong, here with Mr. Dane DuPont from HVERI, the Hawaiian Volcano Education and Resilience Institute. Today is Thursday, January 11th, 2024. Kilauea is still up to her usual activity. A few less earthquakes this week, Dane. How have you been, man?
I've been busy, but doing good. Trying to keep an eye on it as well as the wind and the weather, which seem to be, been peaking up more lately.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, so we hope to keep today's update a little bit basic because there have been some internet outages in the area. So based on that, we like to be as efficient as possible, as well as USGS has been reporting some outages on their own data streams as well. So we'll keep it pretty basic today, but we'll go through the paces as usual and summarize what's happened this past week. As usual, Dane will lead the discussion on the chat, collect some questions for us to discuss along the way. Anything else before we get into it, Dane, today?
No, I don't think so. Try and keep it simple. We will have an announcement about our plan for the next 2 weeks because we do have the Volcano Awareness Month stuff going on and how that will play out going forward.
Right. And the bottom line is our schedule is not the usual schedule the next couple of weeks here. We'll be all over the place and it'll be weird. But we'll review that in detail towards the end here. All right. Thanks, Dane. So with that said, we'll get into our Hawaiian Volcano summary for this week. Let me get the screen switched around here for us. And this week's Hawaiian volcano summary, you can see Kilauea has had low-level earthquake activity over the past week, mostly around the summit region, with some low-level activity continuing in this upper East Rift connector area right through here. These earthquakes are colored by depth, so there have been some larger deep events south of the caldera as well, colored in blue here. The Pahala swarm continues off to the southwest, and the shallow earthquake swarm by Pu'uko on the southwest rift is also ongoing, suggesting that there's still magma moving through this long network of cracks from the summit and down into the southwest rift as such. But we have new satellite imagery this week that suggests that that's not the only place that's inflating and swelling, but quite a bit of that's happening in this area south of the caldera between the rift zones, the upper East Rift connector and the southwest rift connector as well. So that's the map view. If we look at the earthquake rates for the last month, you see that the peak was just before New Year's, right there. And since then, it's been fairly quiet with low levels of earthquakes compared to before. Looking at the tilt meters in the summit area, this is the Sand Hill Station for the last month. And these two colored lines are proxies for the blue one for the summit area at Halema'uma'u, and the green line for the rift zone area just southwest of the summit. And we're seeing here that there's been inflation in both areas, although there are times when you see deflation at the summit and then inflation on the rift zone as presumably magma is moving from the summit through the system into the rift zone and then leaving a pressure void behind it. So interesting to note how these things have changed over time. Over the last week, the inflation has been fairly steady on both. Although in the last few days, there was an interesting period of time when a summit was inflating here in blue, while the rift zone initially began to deflate before kicking in and then catching up. So something akin to the magma pressure is still coming into the volcano. It was not able to penetrate into the southwest rift until some threshold was passed. It broke through, and now we have enough magma to sustain inflation both in the southwest rift and at the summit again. The difference being now we're doing it without all the earthquakes. So not quite as much as a couple weeks ago, but still healthy coming in, and the volcano is still swelling. The image release from satellite data from the USGS is shown here. This is capturing unrest from the end of November to the first week of January. And I'll highlight the area that they've suggested has the most satellite measured uplift right in here. And this is hard to see, but there are some color fringes, the bullseye of these INSAR images, suggesting there's been more or less 4.5 centimeters or 2 inches of uplift in this area within the past 5 weeks or so, we'll say. This is in addition to what we saw previously, swelling more in the southwest rift area over here. So certainly you see different parts of the volcano responding to the injection of magma underground, and the area is moving around. It's been moving around ever since early October. On Mauna Loa, it's been pretty quiet. This is the last month here on the bottom, and the depth of earthquakes in the summit area. So within the last week or so, it's been pretty quiet, especially at depth. Nothing is happening with deep earthquakes, but there still are the shallow earthquakes that are part of the background process of the volcano refilling. So all is as expected in Mauna Loa, and nothing new to report there, even though it continues to refill, building up to its next eruption in the future. Not anytime imminently here. And that's the summary for this week. So with that said, we'll come into some observations. We'll start with a webcam today, looking at the summit of Kilauea. There's our live look. You still see plenty of mineral deposits around this central would have been calling it. It's not exactly a plug. It's like a cap here that's been rising with a lava lake since the early days in late 2020. And lots of fumes still coming from this most exposed area. It's thought that this area might have been thinned by all the magma and lava rubbing on the bottom of it as the lava lake is filled and lifted over time. And a really interesting, different thing today is just really the wind direction. The wind's blowing right to left, which is not how it usually goes. So this tells you a little bit of the weather pattern that we're in with Kona winds here. And I haven't seen too much of this gas blowing into the neighborhoods, possibly because the wind has been quite gusty and strong, and that keeps the concentrations focused into small areas. So still gas coming out, blowing in some weird directions in case you happen to be nearby and smell it. But otherwise, it looks pretty similar to recent views of the summit there. So not much more to add on our visual observations this week. We can quickly move on to our hazard summary, which is the gases. So we've mentioned these here. And to illustrate that, we can bring up the National Park Air Quality Alert website, shown here. And all the stations around the summit are all showing green at present. And all the charts are showing that the air quality has been in the green all day, despite the Kona wind directions. The exception being at Uekahuna, where there have been some spikes of particulate matter, PM 2.5. You see some oranges here coming up over the last day or so. That might be stuff coming up in the gas plume, but to me, it's just as likely with these high winds that you could be picking up some of that material loose in the desert and the downwind parts of Kilauea and remobilizing them, putting them back into the air, and that could be, it's certainly polluting the air, but it's not coming out of the volcano fresh at this exact moment. So that's the air quality in our volcanic hazard summary. It's looking pretty good, but be careful and follow National Park instructions if you are visiting the summit area. Right, so we like to talk about our hazards since our mission is to improve preparedness through education. And this is our main hazard, even during non-eruptive times here. Moving on to the earthquakes. I'm showing here earthquakes for the past day on Kilauea. I'll zoom it out so you can see the whole rest of the island as well. And really, most of the action is Kilauea and Pahala. But as we've previously shown, these earthquakes plotted by time, colored by time, don't give you the full picture of how things are moving at depth. So first of all, let's expand our time frame to go back to see all of the last week. And here's all the last week. And what you might notice is this lack of earthquakes anywhere in here or in here, at least the ones that register on this USGS map. Because this map run from the national office is filtering out some of the smaller events. And you don't really see everything that is happening. Of what you do see, there are some adjustments here. This is that deep earthquake, 3.2 at 18 miles down. You do see a couple adjustments in this Koaʻe connection, but most of it is underneath Haleʻimaʻumau itself. This is where most of the activity has been, and these are decent size events. 2.0 happened earlier today, 2.1 yesterday, 2.1 yesterday morning, 2.5 yesterday, even earlier in the morning. So these are not insignificant. If they were to build up in frequency and intensity, then you would expect lava to break out from this central crater area. And the fact that we still see earthquakes here does suggest that there are viable pathways in that direction. And so whenever it does pressurize enough to break to the surface, this is still a very high candidate of where this could happen here. So this is showing the past week, which is really what's the most recent state here. If I put it back to the last 30 days, I'll just contrast that with you guys. You can see where all these earthquakes in the white have been that have not showed up in the past week here for comparison. So showing the earthquakes by depth now. This is the other USGS site. We're on just the last 2 days. This one does not give us a 1 week option. And once again, there it is, mostly Kilauea and Pahala. And the deep earthquakes are colored in blue, while the shallow ones are in red. So in this view, even more dramatic, that in the shallow system of Kilauea, you have that little patch right there at Halema'uma'u, and a little bit down at Pu'uko, and that's really it. In comparison to the last 2 weeks, where you see that pre-New Year swarm there, and a stronger response in Upper East Rift Connector right in here. So that's really it for where the earthquakes have been. Today we'll shuffle the order a little bit to bring up Volcano Watch next. So this week's Volcano Watch is entitled, Where is Magma Stored in Kilauea? And this is something we've reviewed before, mostly by explaining this graphic included in the update this week. And we've discussed how Kilauea has a shallow magma reservoir under Halema'uma'u, a slightly deeper one under the South Caldera, just slightly to the south of Halema'uma'u. And it has seismic southwest rift zone right here, where we've seen all the earthquakes recently. It has a shallower volcanic southwest rift, which we have not seen any activity on thus far. And perhaps this is because Mauna Loa is right there pushing against it. She is still swelling as well, with connections from the South Caldera Reservoir, both to the southwest and to the East Rift Zone. And curiously, I'll talk about this a little bit more today, because this is the most interesting thing noted to me, is this letter K here. This is the Koaʻe Reservoir. So in this particular cross-section, this is just drawn as a little bit fatter or wider part of this conduit from the caldera into the rift zone. In practice, this is likely much, much more complex, especially when you consider this is the apex of that triangle zone where Halema'uma'u was at the top. And you have the East Rift Zone over here, and Southwest Rift Zone, Koaʻe Fault Zone, all in there into that triangle. So the tip of that triangle is right where this K is, and somehow the magma is injecting both into the Koaʻe Fault Zone and finding a path into the East Rift Zone, and also connecting into the Southwest Rift Zone, all in that area. So having a projection that flattens all of that into 2D is not exactly giving us a full picture here. Maybe just as well, since we don't really know the details of what that looks like in 3D. But that's a caveat of this graphic here. And the reason I bring this up is that because beyond describing, just a second here. So the reason I bring this up is because beyond describing how this model has come to be favored through measurements in the surface, swelling of one chamber while the other one is contracting, movement of magma from one place to the other, and subsidence and inflation, all those kind of patterns are what inform this map. But beyond all of that, which you can find on our Facebook group and website, I'm going to highlight just one short piece of this article here towards the end. So right here is what we're going to look at. Earthquake locations and patterns of deformation over the past several months suggest that several zones of magma accumulation at the summit have been recently active. Several zones. In addition to the Halema'uma'u and South Caldera reservoirs, magma appears to be leaking into the Koaʻe and seismic Southwest Rift Zone. So we've described this pattern, but we have not actually named the Koaʻe reservoir as part of this. Considering that, it seems fairly obvious to be the case, but great to have them take the lead and point that out for us here in Volcano Watch this week. So we'll leave that for you to explore further on your own if you're curious how that model came to be. And we'll move on to our monitoring segment and looking at these different zones. So let's get that on the screen here. And let's start with this recent release map from the USGS, which now is showing the last month and a half-ish of earthquakes, as well as an uplift in this area right through here, as we pointed out in our summary. Right, and to recap, there is our triangle once again, in case it helps you to see it, not with my hands, but actually drawn on a map. That's the zone we're talking about, with this East Rift connector bridging the pathway from the summit to the East Rift Zone, which is oriented more like this. So it comes and takes a bend. And the Southwest Rift connector, this one right here, also comes and takes a bend before rejoining the shallow Southwest Rift Zone, which goes off in that direction like that. So right in here is a zone of faults, right? Because this area is all moving to the south. You have essentially stacks of lots of cracks have occurred over time through here. And because of that, magma has repeatedly come and infilled these cracks. Usually it does so without a whole lot of seismicity. Usually it does so without erupting as well. And I look forward to the After Dark in the Park coming up this coming Tuesday, where Professor Steve Lundblad from University of Hawaii Hilo will be talking about this exact area of the volcano and its history. So if you're curious about that in more detail, make sure to tune into that to hear someone else talk about it differently than I have been. And it's always good to hear multiple perspectives and ways of describing things here. So I thought we could review from the mounts imagery what the patterns of swelling in Kilauea have been since October. So this is where we're getting this data from. And there are panels for every 12-day window going back through time. So the most recent one, of which that USGS map was based, looks like this. And you can pretty clearly see the bullseye centered right there, just south of the caldera. If I zoom it in, this crater right here, that is Koaʻe crater, right? And that may be the strongest, one of the strongest lines of evidence that there is shallow magma stored underneath here. Because to form a crater, you have to move that magma somewhere else and allow the ground to collapse. So if it's too deep, you don't get the collapses, it just moves here and there. And in fact, you have pit craters at the surface. It does suggest there is some complexity there, right? And that's how we know, to carry that thought further, the path of magma through the East Rift connector, because there is a pit crater there at Luamanu, and Puhimau, and Koʻokoʻolau, and eventually get to Hiaka, and that traces the suspected path of magma into the rift zone when it is doing so robustly. Right now, we're not sure to what extent that is happening. It seems that because we've seen this entire East Rift connector area active, it seems likely that magma may be making its way back into that area, as it very often does for most of the history of the volcano. More on that in a minute. That's not changing the threat in a short term towards people here. That's just doing what it normally does. But to finish our story here of how magma has accumulated in different areas over time, we'll step back every 2 weeks here. So here we are the past 2 weeks. There is our center. I'll move it to previous 2 weeks where it's harder to tell. Maybe it's off over here. Maybe there's something happening in the center, not quite as clear at the summit. But let's go back 2 weeks before that. And now we see the zone of inflation is actually in that southwest rift zone area near the caldera. And if I keep going back in time, you see here it's in the caldera in Hale Ma'uma'u. Going back further, here it is back in the south again. And a week that started it all off back in early October, one of the strongest pulses you see centered here south of the crater. So quickly back through from oldest to youngest now. I'll show you how this zone of swelling has migrated over time. We've described this a little bit like filling an air mattress, perhaps, right? Let's imagine your air mattress is all the way empty and it's got these folds in it and you're filling it with your air. And one part of the mattress might pop up first before the other one. Another one might pop up over here. And then as it moves past a fold, it might undo a fold and be able to push its way to the further parts of the mattress. And if it does that, the part closer to the pump might actually deflate a little bit as all that air moves further away from or it's being injected. So the best analogy I can share right now, a little bit of parallel there. But really you can see different parts of the volcano swelling different weeks depending on what area is able to fill. Which goes to show there's a lot of space down there, and it's been filling this space enough where it's not pressurizing all in one place, but it can fill all of that space and then move and fill over this space and fill that space. And so this extended pattern, to me, suggests that there's still more work to be done to build us to an eruption, whether it be filling that space or cutting off access to that space in some way, closing the pathways, constricting the pathways, restricting them so less magma gets through, anything along those lines to force a standoff of where the magma is going to go. Right now, it's just filling in the ground, and there's nothing forcing it anywhere else. We're seeing earthquakes because there's movement of the ground, interaction of the magma with the faults, and enough pressure to continually drive that injection while still swelling the volcano all at the same time. That's the big picture here. We can look a little bit more at the GPS. So here is the summit stations. This is 2-year GPS plots. And as usual, these 3-panel plots, the top component is the east-west component, the middle one is the north-south, and the bottom one is the up and down. So the easiest way to tell if magma is coming in is the up and down, because the north and south and east and west are also subject to other motions of the ground beyond filling and pushing from below. So the cleanest signal is the up and down signal. The others tell you quite a bit as well, but you have to be more careful in interpreting them. So some things that are interesting, we still see uplift at Uikahuna, at Byron's Ledge. There's four summit stations at the outlet and at Crater Rim. Although, if I zoom into it, looking more to up, we see it looks like more robust uplift in the northern stations, here and here. And the southern stations might be showing some sign of actually deflating a little bit. And the way this happens is just like we saw on Mauna Loa last year. The volcano swells and fills with pressure. That can push the flank. When it does so, it makes more room. The pressure then drops and the thing can subside. So what if that's the pattern that's actually occurring? What you'd expect to happen is this line might drop down, then back up and back down, and it would do this zigzag pattern until it can no longer fit any more magma into that accordion of that localized area. So that's interesting to note, not just at Crater Rim, because we can be suspect of the most recent data points on these tier plots that still often are corrected and recalibrated after the fact. But when we see it in more than one station, it lends a little bit more credibility to the fact that this may be a true signal emerging right into this plot here. Focusing on a summit still, Uikahuna has been moving to the northwest. It's the one most out of the way, so not a whole lot of change there since the last eruption. Byron's Ledge is in the east, really the southeast. Its east-west movement hasn't changed, being pushed from the west to the east, but its north-south movement is showing a little bit of wiggle here, where you can see it was being pushed to the north, right, because of all its injection south in the Koaʻe Fault Zone in the triangle. But just recently, it seems to be getting pushed more to the south, which would suggest that inflation at Halemaʻumaʻu itself, under the pit, is now become, in the last few days, the most dominant signal. Once again, the centers of inflation shifting from the south to the north, and just happens to be doing it as we speak. So that's an interesting thing to note there at Byron's Ledge. And it's not the only station as well. If we come here, let's see where else we can see something interesting. The Crater Rim signal that was getting pushed to the north as well for much of that time now seems to be more steadily pushed to the south, suggesting more buildup at Halemaʻumaʻu as well. And finally, the outlet station, which is closest to that southwest rift entry point, southwest rift connector from the caldera, we noticed this funny signal right in here on the east-west component about a month ago, where prior to that, really the outlet station was getting pushed to the east because most of the injection was happening to the southwest of it. Then that stabilized, and it started getting pushed to the west, right there. That would suggest that Halemaʻumaʻu became more dominant, or Koaʻe, because they're both to the east. Halemaʻumaʻu is to the east and north, Koaʻe is to the east and just to the east. And either way, that could be pushing it to the west. And now, with the same caveats of the data at the very far right end being subject to review, it does appear that this is now moving back towards the east. So again, that shift from the summit to the west. And I'm speaking as if there's only one big focus and one big point, but the system is so large, you actually could have swelling and filling coming in and propagating down in one direction and swelling in one area, while at the same time, a different area could be collecting magma and swelling as well. And so the timing might be slightly different, and you might see these patterns overlap, but there certainly can be multiple areas, and those areas are alternating which one is the dominant one. So that's the interesting thing with the GPS stations around the summit. If we go to the south flank, we see the upper part of the south flank is really this triangle of the Koaʻe. So we're seeing similar patterns of dropping, very slight dropping, closest to that tip of the triangle at Ahua as well. Further afield, the closer you get to the East Rift Zone bend itself, we're seeing just steady swelling. Puhimau has been rising and moving steadily. Devil's Throat has been rising and maybe a little quicker recently, although with some scatter here at the very right end, so maybe adjustments as well happening, small scale localized. Further over, we don't see any other changes that are really convincing yet in any other stations. Looking at Kalapana Trail, this is the one we're curious that might be the linchpin to open the East Rift Zone to Pu'o'o. It is showing a slight southerly trend finally right here, which we've seen before, twice here, before those adjustments preserved the closure of the rift zone by a movement of the ground over here. And so that's what it was trying to go south, and okay, it's going back north and pinching and close. And it was trying to go south, and it's back north and pinching and close. And at some point, you imagine it'll start going south and keep going south. And we'll be past this little wiggle. We're trying to wiggle the block out of there, right? Or it's like trying to parallel park a car or get out of a very tight parking spot. You have to just do a little shimmy to get your way out of there. So I imagine this block is doing a little shimmy, working to the south and to the north, trying to wiggle its way to reopen that pathway to accommodate the path of magma. And nothing convincing yet, because we've seen it do this before and then jump back to the north. So that may happen still, but it's something to keep an eye on for sure here. Yeah, and with the same caveats, maybe, the scatter on this up and down signal is pretty large, but there is a slight suggestion here that it might be rising a little bit too. So we'll see. If we look further from the summit, this is all the way to the coast at Ilemakule. This is the area that if magma is moving all the way to the southwest to where we see the shallow earthquakes at Pu'uko, the furthest ones to the southwest, then we expect to see continued movement still in these areas over here. So at the coast, Ilemakule is still getting pushed to the south and to the east, suggesting at the very least that the ground is still mobile there, perhaps aided by the injection of magma. Perhaps it's still going if magma is not even being injected any further, but what we can say for sure, it's still moving over there. And if it's still moving, it can actually create space for magma to be accommodated underground. And that's the interaction of the faults and the magma at one level, with the other being that the magma itself, if it's able to reduce the frictional pressure on a fault in any way by injecting and maybe lifting a little bit, or by putting any kind of fluid in there, or even if it's adding ground up lava powder that helps that area be more mobile and actually rub and move back and forth, right? You have to have some layer of ground up rocks in between two big blocks there. However that's happening, it's still able to move, and that means it's able to accommodate any further pulse coming from the summit down the rift zone. Hilinapali, which is closer to the summit, is also showing that. It's been moving to the south steadily the entire time. However, the east-west signal has been a little bit more variable, where initially it was getting pushed quite fast to the east, and really in recent weeks that seems to have slowed down. And we've seen that matching the slowdown of seismicity as well in the Southwest Rift. We've still seen seismicity there, but it's been more pulsing rather than as continuous as it was in the first couple months. So it was still moving to the east, but at a slower rate than previously. And we'll see whether it accelerates or maintains that, but once again, still moving, even if slightly slower. Right? Everything else is still showing the same patterns. You see uplift all the way over to Nene, and all the stations further away from the rift zone at the coast are not showing anything unusual. It's all what you'd expect there. So on a rift zone itself, we can look at Mauna Ulu is a little bit blown out by the scale here. So we'll just go to Kaʻanui Hamo. And the important thing, look at the bottom panels, whether they're rising or falling, it's still dropping. It may be getting pushed further to the south and east because this whole rift zone is southeast of the summit. But it's dropping down, meaning it's not getting pushed by magma and coming up. Right? And you'd expect a sustained uplift signal if it was actually magma, and not one of these shimmies, because the shimmies can also not only move these blocks left and right, they can also tilt them and ramp them up in slight ways on the edges, especially. So that's why you see variation in these signals, and we're more interested in the long-term trend. And so that's the Kamomoa. It looks pretty well within this range of scatter. We go a little bit further to Kaʻanui Kamomoa here. We're just at Kaʻanui Hamo, so at Kamomoa. And now it's interesting, we do see a slight increase in the eastern push, right? Likely because of magma in a Koaʻe Fault Zone area, more directly west of this site. But also, it does appear like there might be something funny going on with the uplift over there too. So there are some slight funny signals. You see this last data point is further down, so we'll have to wait to see this corrected. But it wouldn't be entirely shocking if magma begins leaking from this now massively swollen Koaʻe Fault Zone into this upper and middle east rift area as far as Pu'o'o, and only to Pu'o'o, as this next stage of the recovery from 2018 disruption. So this is Kaʻanui Hamo. We can go further down to Pu'o'o. Pu'o'o itself is also showing one of these little funny slight upwards and then a jump down. So we'll see how this plays out. Jacuzzi a little further to the south. It's also showing a little bit of this with this same kind of scatter. If you go all the way down to Jonica Station, the one that's closest to the lower east rift zone, we're zoomed in a lot more. So the scatter is larger, but within this trend, there is no uplift happening at all down there. So that is typical. When we reviewed historical eruptions of Kilauea at its summit and both rift zones, the east rift zone, the summit and east rift zone all the way to Pu'o'o is the most dominant segment. I forget the exact percentages. I want to say 70% of eruptions remain within that area. And it's very, very rare that they go beyond that to the lower east rift zone, as happened in 2018. So we certainly recognize the concern and the trauma that we all have from that having occurred in our lifetimes not that long ago. But it takes a lot of work for the volcano to be able to do that. And this may be the next step, but it has further steps to take before we're worried about that happening. In the short term, if it were to do that, it would refill to Pu'o'o area first. We'd see pressurization of that area, and maybe you might have eruptions from the area of Mauna Ulu or Pu'o'o or Luamanu on the upper east rift connector, as we've seen and described in recent updates too. So that is the data from the GPS. We often show you the other data from the USGS too. Oh, it did fix their website. So thankfully we have some charts to look at now. So over the last week, earthquakes per day have been fairly steady, 50 to 70, which is fairly low for recent times. and no huge pulses in either the shallow or the deep sections. The tilt over the last week has been net inflation with a big deflation-inflation cycle in between. The overall magnitude of inflation is not that great. We're looking at 1.5 at the end of the week and negative 0.5, so about 2-ish microradians of inflation over the last week. Our short-term GPS, we'll just move past that. It's looking a little noisy, but we're looking for big jumps that make all this look flat, and we see a point very far from the others. Right now, they're all kind of scattered within this very zoomed in range in both these plots here. But we have them up in case we want to catch any sudden movement, any sudden jerk of the ground to the north or to the east here. So here are the past week of earthquakes. And as you can see, this is where we see the smaller threshold events showing up on a map, colored by depth once again here, that don't show up on that main USGS page. And so there are more earthquakes occurring than appear on that national page. And this particular graphic picks up more than any other way that we have to access this from the public. So that does suggest there is still pressure from this zone that's swelling against that. Here we see a little bit more clearly the trend of the East Rift Zone right there. There is an East Rift connector. And the Koaʻe Fault Zone goes like this. And so if we're filling this whole area all the way to here, then it makes sense that at some point you could then next go to this upper East Rift area through there. Right? We're moving the center of filling of magma from originally it was just the summit. We've activated the Southwest Rift, we've activated Koaʻe, and it appears we've activated the East Rift connector too. So what would be next would be injection that way. Not to say that we know this is coming in the short term, but it seems more likely than before with those little hints of signals we're seeing. And just to reiterate, the lower East Rift Zone is way down here. Right? The typical 70% of eruptions are usually going to end somewhere in a zone of in here, right? Which can put the Kalapana Kaimu area at some risk, but it's less so for anything beyond that, right? And for worse or for better, many of the areas that would be at risk in the Kalapana Kaimu area have already been covered by lava in recent decades. So that is a limited exposure as well. So earthquakes for the last month. Here's our quiet, our peak before New Year's, and the one that we had about a month ago, right there. And you can see we're just waiting for the next one to come. The pulse in the shallow regions, nothing really equivalent ever since. So fairly quiet. And the month tilt plot is the one that I usually like to see because it's zoomed out enough to see past these deflation inflation signals that seem to be fairly common still, superimposed upon the longer trend swelling of the volcano. On a month scale, we go from -3 to +7, we'll call it. So that's about 10 microradians in a month of net gain of swelling. This is ground tilt, the ground getting pushed away from the center of the volcano by this measure of inclination, right? Like a degree, you can have a radian. This is a microradian. The Sand Hill Station, the blue line is the same source at Halemaʻumaʻu as Uekahuna Station here, so it shows the same trend, but compressed because our scale is different. And also picking up the Southwest Rift Zone area. We described last week how different amounts of magma supply could have different consequences of how the volcano is behaving, right? We saw last week inflation of both a summit and a Southwest Rift and earthquakes along both, right? So now we're seeing inflation along both of them without the earthquakes. Earlier in the week, we saw inflation only at the summit where it was not strong enough to break into the Southwest Rift, where it seemed like somehow the injection of magma had maybe pinched off or temporarily blocked that pathway. However, that didn't last, and once it was reestablished, it's now back on track as it was previously. So it's the same song and dance, the same game we've been looking at for 3 months now. And we'll just wait to see when it's ready to do something different. Right? And just reminding that we have detailed similar events in the 60s and in the 80s lasting in a range of 6 to 8 months altogether. Sometimes erupting at the end and sometimes not. So we'll finish off Kilauea just by reviewing the updates, the text updates. They're all fairly similar. So from yesterday's, I just want to highlight the fact that they do note several intermittent data outages have occurred over the past day that are being worked on being resolved. So this was yesterday. So Tuesday to Wednesday, data outages. We just saw there were some happening still today. Still some issues with their website. But the important update catching up is today's. The volcano is not erupting. There's really not a whole lot of new information in here. It's essentially saying we have very low seismicity in areas that have been active recently. We have all the same caveats, and it's really nothing novel in here to highlight for you guys that we have not covered previously. So just so you can see it, the USGS is saying all the same things that we are saying. In fact, they are one of our primary sources. And we, as usual, would like to extend our mahalo and thanks to them for sharing all these graphs and data and these text updates and working past 5 p.m. to try to get their systems back online here when they're having issues, right? So you can tell they're working hard over there. Mahalo, USGS. So that is Kilauea monitoring this week. We'll very, very briefly recap Mauna Loa. Here is a plot of Mauna Loa's tilt over the last week. The daily variations you can ignore. This recent pattern here is likely the snowfall collecting in Mauna Kea, Mauna Loa as well. I was not able to capture a webcam view of this earlier since they were having data issues, but I'm not sure if it's still there, if it was all snow or rain or what, but we did see snow in the mountains this morning when the clouds broke briefly after the storm. This is the last week of data, so depth versus the last week, and just a few shallow events. This is that background inflation of the volcano and adjustments as it naturally does. So over the last month, it's a little bit more interesting. Fairly constant, apart from this is a big, we suspect, movement of the flank of the volcano. And since then, we've had steady, slow, very, very slight slow inflation until we had this event in the last couple of days, which seems to me likely storm related right there. Yeah, last month, you can see the gap right here, as we pointed out earlier. Earthquake rates for the last month, the maximum is 5. So very, very low. It makes more sense to look at the last year plot. And so here we are, very low for the last year. And for the last 5 years, here we are, very low once again, too. So very little to discuss on Mauna Loa. Maybe I should jump back just to mention I was pointing out this signal on Mauna Loa. Kilauea has a couple of those as well. Let's see, maybe I didn't scroll down on my map far enough. Where is it? This one, perhaps. Go back. Let's see. See what's going on here. Yeah, that's what happened. Okay. So, all right. We did Sand Hill. We did. Okay. Here is the East Rift Zone at Pu'o'o. And a blue line coming down. We saw this coming up, and this was a little suspect, and I was curious whether this might be a real volcanic signal or potentially the beginning of the rain and weather that was falling in our area. I live not too far from Pu'o'o, so it helps me keep track of how much rain is falling in this forest area around here. So I'm not quite sure. This may be something else, but certainly these two bunny ears here our two peaks of rain over the last few days. So this is certainly a rain signal, and this is certainly a rain signal here too. And now that we've passed those and it's now deflating, I'm curious to see how far down this actually drops when we come back to this level and resume this downward trend. And if so, that would lead more credibility to the fact that this might be weather related. And if not, it could be actual swelling of the ground through movement of these blocks in the rift zone doing their shimmies and wiggling to try to make this pathway more viable for magma to move through. So that is a little suspect still, and part of the story of potentially the rift zone being refilled, but this is not conclusive or convincing in any way. And maybe what we see in the next week of what this plot does over here gives us more information about that, as well as whatever the USGS may share with us. What we can say is that there's been no other signal. There's no gas signal. There's no earthquake signals. The GPS is still showing contraction. There's really nothing to be concerned about there. And this might be the first hint of something dubious at present. What's curious to me is that we do see further to the east at the Jonica station. We noted this last week. The deflation rate increased just before Christmas. And so is it possible that there is something within the rift deeper down that might be moving from one area to the other and maybe causing a little bump? That stuff can happen. And if so, it'll be a short-lived event as well because it's a limited supply. And we'll see if this line also at some point resumes its shallower plot or if it keeps going at this rate here, right? And that maybe can tell us whether it's something that's being driven from above. Like imagine driving a wedge from above. If you have magma just sinking into a crack and it's just getting deeper and deeper and just wedging it further and further apart, maybe you accelerate at some point. One possibility that comes to mind. Or it could be that you actually have movement from east and west, as we're describing, between the Jonica area and closer to Pu'u, although that's still very much in the air. It's just something I imagine people were probably considering, thinking about. And so I don't want to ignore that thought. Point out that it is here on a graph, but still very suspect, and we need to know more about what's going on. And no cause for concern in the short term as well. All right, so that was Mauna Loa and a little bit bonus Kilauea, since I forgot that the first time. I think that shows us the gas is still low, earthquakes for the last month in that triangle, as we've described. And when we get to the GPS, across the summit of Kilauea, this steep section being when it was filling just Hale Ma'u, and then when it starts filling the area to the south as well, and the southwest rift, with this pattern we've described where it can be doing this little wiggle, not unlike what we saw Mauna Loa doing about a year and a half ago, building up to its eruption. As its south flank moved, summit repressurized, moved the south flank, repressurized, and just kept going in a cycle. So that's where we are right now. We're in this little loop, and we'll just see how long we can accommodate that magma coming underground and keep it going. Most importantly, why I wanted to come back to this, the GPS at Pu'u, despite those little wiggles, is still showing contraction. The sides are still getting closer together. So the ground is dropping down, and if there's any movement of magma in there, it's so small that the tilt meter is picking it up, but it's not showing any effect on the larger ground movements. And that is the data for today. So with that said, we can review our community corner, which mostly right now is Volcano Awareness Month programs. I hope you were able to catch the stream this past Tuesday from the National Park by Dr. Matt Patrick on Kilauea's 5 crater filling summit eruptions since 2018. There was a hike last week at Kahuku. There's a hike coming up on Saturday at Kilauea Iki. Talk story yesterday at Na'alehu was nice. I went to that one and talk story there. I saw several community members having their questions answered. So great to see this expanded outreach from the USGS. There's another one of those on Monday in Kona at the Hawaii Keiki Museum, 11 a.m. to 4 p.m. with Katie Mulliken. And then next week, Tuesday, as I mentioned before, by Dr. Steve Lundblad from University of Hawaii, Eruptions near Kilauea Summit. So our next stream will be this event here on Tuesday, the talks, followed by Wednesday, geochemical monitoring, what will broadcast from University of Hawaii in Hilo, followed by next week, Thursday, will be Pahala, earthquakes beneath Pahala at 6 p.m. So this would be in lieu of our usual update. We will not be doing our regular HVERY update on the 18th because of this. And while I'm at it, I would mention the following week on Thursday as well, we'll be going to Kona to share this from Kona as well. So we'll likely not have a regular update on that day as well, which means our next scheduled update, should Pele allow us to go with the schedule and not disrupt it and do something unscheduled, would be February 1st for us. So that would be 3 weeks from today. We realize this is a bigger gap. So if there's something interesting, we'll make sure to drop some short videos or some posts to share what's going on. But there's really so much content. We can maybe just jump in as needed. And really, there's going to be plenty to talk about for a while afterwards, right? You see 4 talks this next week, ending next week, Friday in Pahoa at the Lava Museum, with a talk by Mike Zoller on the mapping. And that's really the busiest week of the entire month for the After Dark, the Awareness Month programs. So
yeah, gonna be a busy week.
Yeah, I'll just keep going because just make sure you have this on your calendars. Hike at Mauna Ulu on the 20th. The following week, there are 2 talks. We mentioned the Kona one, but After Dark in the Park, Southwest Rift by, I believe, Drew Downs. So that would be excellent as well. They're covering Summit, Koaʻe, and Southwest Rift. Right, so great. Our 3 most relevant areas of interest. And then the last After Dark in the Park will be Frank Truesdell update on Mauna Loa. Right? So, and Samoa will round it out as well. So lots of different events here. Hopefully we will not burn out in the middle of all this, and we'll be back with you guys fresh on the 1st. So yeah, that's the schedule, Dan. Anything you want to chime in on?
No, just one note is we're going to try and bring these live, and most of the stuff on there, like the After the Darks in the Park, we know that we can do those live. We know that we can do the Hilo one live, but depending on connectivity and other factors will limit our ability to do some of them. And the hikes themselves, those will probably just be recorded and edited because unless you want to hear an hour worth of crunching on Cinder, right? We'll try and get through some spots and edit those down, I believe, and give you something a little more palatable.
Yeah, best effort on those, right? That very weather dependent. Weather dependent. So if we can get something and put it out, we will, but no promises on the hikes. Yeah.
Right.
Do best we can. So yeah, Dan, I'll pass it to you for some mahalos.
Yeah. I'd like to thank everybody that tuned in today. We rely on viewers like you to help get this message out there. We don't have an advertising budget or anything like that. So we rely on word of mouth, sharing, liking, helping with the algorithm, all that kind of stuff to be able to get this kind of information out there instead of the normal quick buck type stuff that you see online where it's overhyped and a lot of speculation. We try and avoid all that. So if you appreciate that, maybe consider sharing and also maybe even donating. We take donations on hferry.org/donate, but we also take super chats and YouTube as well. Just know that as of right now, if you want as much money to come to us as possible, it's through the hferry donate link on our website. We do have a couple questions here, not many, and we don't have any donations to go through, so we can just jump into some questions. Do want to thank everybody that has donated on hferry.org. I know we don't do readouts on those, but your contributions help tremendously. All right. So you ready for some questions there, Phil?
Yeah, let's discuss what we can.
All right. So Dennis asks, Is there a significance to the recent uptick in large earthquakes on the slump below the eastern rift zone?
On the slump, yeah. So it's a good question. But I think the earthquakes that are happening, the larger earthquakes that are happening to the south. Let's see if we can get the map up here. Let's find the right map. Maybe this one. So, so without knowing exactly what Dennis means here, I think there's two candidate earthquakes of what he's talking about. One would be these blue ones in here, which we have seen an uptick in. Let's see if I can make this a longer time frame. Yeah, okay, so yeah, there have been some of these over here, which are just part of the pathway, the pathway of magma into Kilauea. It's thought that it comes something like this, and then up in this area over here. But also, it might come this way, up over here. And it might also come just straight up from below under here as well. So multiple pathways coming up, and this is just showing that the supply into the volcano from below would be healthy. The second pattern of earthquakes in a slump, so this may make more sense, and this maybe is what you mean, Dennis, but these ones over here that we had, this is where we had our magnitude 5.1, was it? About a month, was it a month ago, month and a half ago or so? Memory got a little hazy with the holidays here, but that one was right in here, so there could be some continuing movement and adjustment from that. We have seen the South Flank earthquakes active for almost the entire time since 2018. They do accelerate and slow a little bit, and so the fact that we had a 5.1 recently to me means that we've likely unlocked some aspect of that fault or of that system right here, which means other parts of it can start catching and generate earthquakes also. All of this, the 5.1 especially, right, was all generated by this push of magma in this triangle zone right through here. So if you have a crack in here and you're filling it with magma, the magma is going to pour into it. It's going to go probably from the bottom up, but at some point it's going to fill that crack and start pushing, trying to wedge it apart until it's full, and the magma then diverts somewhere with less pressure to overcome. But when you're doing that, you're actually expanding and thickening, right? Imagine like a stack of papers, a stack of magazines. We're going to come and stick another magazine in here, and stick another one in here, and stick another one in here. It's like maybe like your bookshelf, and you're just trying to stick extra books in between, and it's just getting tighter and tighter and tighter and tighter. And so in this case, it's not a bookshelf. This far end actually moves in response to that pressure of continued injection to the south. So that's fundamentally what's driving this movement over here, right? Of especially recently, as far as what's been different recently than before, because overall the whole flank of the volcano is moving, and that's what I say has been still active since 2018, and that is one of the fundamental main drivers of Kilauea. Right, so
sorry, I'm muted. Go ahead.
We often talk about there's two main drivers of the volcano. It's either magma coming in, creating pressure and pushing things out of the way, or it's gravity itself pulling things down and settling them. And that in particular is a south flank. So the USGS has put this in previous papers as who's driving the car? Is it the magma at the summit, or is it actually the south flank? Right? Because magma at the summit can pressurize the volcano and push the south flank out of the way. Or gravity can pull the south flank, create space, and allow magma to then to fill the shallow areas as well. And there are both cases have been true in the past of the volcano. Right now, it does seem to be magma driven at this exact moment. But following a collapse in 2018, this still was ongoing, and it was likely at that point gravity driven. So it's always a combination there, and it's always both coming together there. And so if I want to answer, Dennis, and we're going to have Ken's question similar. I don't know if we'll put Ken's on there, but similar kind of thing, where it's really the filling of this Koaʻe area that's creating pressure to the south, especially right in here.
All right. We did have a donation that came through from JW. No comment, $10. Appreciate that there, JW, for the support. And yeah, I think you took two birds, one stone with that one, kind of. We will have to look a little bit at the website. I ended up stumbling on another website that was interesting, looking at the one that they had referenced, which Ken had referenced. So that was, I'll have to show you it afterwards. I just stumbled upon it. But hey, appreciate the support there. Appreciate the questions. And yeah, we are at over an hour now. Surprisingly, we didn't have a whole lot to talk about today. Nothing special, but still got our full hour in. And yeah, unless something happens, right? If something happens, like an eruption, then we'll go live. But the plan is to allow USGS the time to speak. We speak enough on here, getting some alternate voices, getting some different perspective in, and hopefully some new data. That's really what I'm hoping for, is some of that AGU data that was released a couple months ago or a month ago, finding its way into the public sphere so we can talk about it more freely.
Yeah, for sure. We'll be more on that in the future as well. Yeah, so it's really much of the same. We could expect more pulses of earthquakes, perhaps. They can wax and wane, as USGS has been saying for months. And so this pattern could last for a while. We might have some more excitement ahead, but unless it actually is working to the surface, then we will stick to our plan here. Yeah.
We did I did run the poll again with the Valentine's Day set as the over-under date, and it is split on it. 48% on the before under and 52 on the over. So just about as close as you get to 50-50 right there.
Yeah, I'll go over. I think over.
I go over as well. Over everybody that's gone under has gotten cleaned out by Vegas, essentially, if we were actually doing this thing.
Yeah, you don't get to play anymore, right?
Yeah.
Except in our game, everyone can keep playing. All good.
Right. All right. Well, thanks everybody for tuning in, and we will see you again. When is our next thing that we will be going live on?
Tuesday.
Is that Tuesday? All right. We'll see everybody Tuesday.
Yeah. Mahalo, Dane. Mahalo, Dano, and Carrie, our ASL interpreters, and all of our viewers, all of our supporters.
Mahalo Lou on the back end with 2 pineapples. They're helping us live stream as always, so appreciate that.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and so unless something else pops up, we'll stick to the plan here. We'll be back with you guys on Tuesday. Then what is it? Tuesday, then Wednesday, and then Thursday. Potentially the Thursday and Friday events are the ones that maybe won't get streamed if the connections are bad. But definitely Tuesday, Wednesday, maybe Thursday and Friday as well. And on from there.
Yep.
So until then, from Hawaiian Volcano Education and Resilience Institute, we have Dane DuPont. I am Philip Ong. Aloha, everybody.